An old man, 78 years old, dedicates his final days to planting trees on an arid hillside, facing mockery and disbelief from the community. "You'll never see those trees grown," everyone says. With trembling hands and unwavering hope, he persists in his silent mission. What no one imagines is that this seemingly senseless act hides a promise made decades ago, capable of transforming not only the landscape, but the heart of an entire village. A story about legacy, faith, and love that transcends generations. The golden light of dawn slid down the arid hillside like a wasted blessing. Even before the first rays warmed the parched earth, a stooped silhouette was already moving with determination along the rocky path. Anthony, at 78, carried on his fragile shoulders the weight of an aged shovel and a bag of seeds, simple tools for a dream many considered impossible. Sweat trickled down his time-worn face, forming small rivers between deep wrinkles, silent witnesses to a life of labor. The village of Dry Valley didn't live up to its name by chance. For decades, rain had become an increasingly rare visitor, transforming what were once fertile fields into an expanse of cracked, hostile land. The younger residents only knew prosperity through stories told by the elders on summer nights, when the unbearable heat drove everyone out of their homes in search of a non-existent breeze. That morning, as on every morning since he began his solitary mission, Anthony dug holes in the hard earth, carefully placed a seed in each one, and covered it with a handful of soil mixed with the little compost he managed to produce in his yard. Then, with the same devotion as someone performing a sacred ritual, he watered each mound with precious water he carried in old buckets from the communal well to the distant hillside. "There goes the crazy old man again," scoffed David, a middle-aged man watching from the road with other villagers, spending the rest of his life planting trees he'll never see grow. "The land is dead, you stubborn old man. Dead as your hopes." Laughter echoed across the hillside, but it didn't reach Anthony's heart. He had long ago learned the difference between hearing and listening. He continued his work with the same silent dedication, as if each seed placed in the ground was a promise that could not be broken. In the center of the village, where a dusty square housed the only local school, Helen finished organizing her books for the day's class. At 32, she was the youngest teacher Dry Valley had ever had, and perhaps the only one who still believed that knowledge could flourish, even in arid lands. From the window of the small classroom, she spotted the solitary figure on the hillside and felt a curiosity she couldn't explain. "Teacher, why does Mr. Anthony plant trees up on the hill every day?" asked Sarah, a girl with lively eyes and messy braids pointing towards the window. Helen watched the child for a moment, admiring how children's questions often touched the core of mysteries adults preferred to ignore. "They say he's planting hope, Sarah. Something we might only understand when it's big enough for us to see." The words left her mouth before she could think, as if a dormant truth had awakened within her. Helen didn't know Anthony's story beyond the rumors circulating in the village. He was a widower, had lost his only daughter when she was young, and lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of the settlement. What moved him to dedicate his final years to a project everyone considered doomed to fail? Spring progressed with particular cruelty that year. The heat, which should have been mild, already heralded a merciless summer. The few clouds that appeared on the horizon never kept their promise of rain, dissipating like dreams at dawn. However, to the surprise of many and despite all predictions, small green shoots began to break through the soil on the hillside, where Anthony worked tirelessly. It was on a Sunday afternoon, when the village slowed its already modest pace, that Helen gathered the courage to climb the hillside. She found the old man kneeling beside one of the newborn seedlings, examining the tender leaves with the care of someone holding a newborn. "They say talking to plants helps them grow," she commented, stopping a few steps away. Anthony slowly raised his gaze. His eyes, a faded blue from time, held a sparkle that contrasted with the surrounding aridity. "It's not just plants that need to hear words of encouragement to grow, my dear. People do too." His voice was surprisingly firm for someone with such a frail appearance. Helen felt immediately welcomed, as if this man was an ancient book full of wisdom waiting to be read. "I'm Helen, the school teacher. I know who you are." A gentle smile lit up his wrinkled face. "I see your work the same way you see mine, from a distance, but with respect." She had never thought that anyone was watching her work. Suddenly, she felt less alone in her own mission. "Why trees, Mr. Anthony?" The question escaped before she could contain it. The old man was silent for a moment, as if considering whether she was ready to hear the answer. Finally, he pointed to a particularly fragile sprout. "See this little warrior? 3 days ago, it didn't exist in the eyes of the world. It was hidden in the darkness, fighting alone. Now it's here, defying everything and everyone." His trembling fingers delicately stroked the tiny plant. "Trees teach us that the impossible just takes a little longer to happen." Helen felt a lump in her throat. There was a depth in those simple words that resonated with her own daily struggle at school, trying to sow knowledge in young minds that often saw no purpose in learning. That night, upon returning to her modest home, the teacher couldn't get the image of the old man and his seedlings out of her mind. Something had changed within her. A small seed of curiosity that, like Anthony's plants, was beginning to break the surface. The next morning, while preparing the day's lesson, Helen had an idea. Instead of the usual science class, she would take the children on a field trip to the hillside. Who better to teach about the cycle of life, perseverance, and hope than that man who planted trees for a future he wouldn't see? News of the visit spread quickly, as everything did in Dry Valley. When Helen arrived at the hillside with her 15 students in an orderly line, she found Anthony better dressed than usual, in a clean shirt, patched in several places but carefully ironed. Beside him, to everyone's surprise, was a rustic table covered with different types of seeds, dried leaves, and pieces of bark. The old man's eyes shone with a recovered youthfulness as he explained the secrets of plants to the children, how each seed carried within it a mysterious code that determined if it would be an imposing oak or a delicate flowering shrub, how roots searched for water deep within the earth, and how leaves transformed sunlight into food. "Everything in nature has a purpose," he said, holding a small seed in his wrinkled palm, "even when we can't see or understand it immediately." Sarah, the girl with the messy braids, shyly raised her hand. "And what's the purpose of planting? Trees you'll never see grow big." The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Anthony looked into the child's eyes with infinite tenderness. "Many years ago, I lost someone I loved more than life itself." His voice trembled slightly. "My daughter, Louise, was only 6 years old when the drought took her life. In those days, water was even scarcer, and diseases were stronger than our ability to fight them." The children listened in reverent silence, instinctively sensing the importance of that moment. "On the night she passed, Louise made me promise that one day I would transform this dry land into a place where other children could run in the shade of tall trees, where water would not be scarce and life would flourish again." Anthony closed his eyes for an instant, as if he could see that promise made so many decades ago. "I spent my life working, taking care of my wife, just surviving. But now, in the time I have left, I am keeping the promise I made." A single tear rolled down the teacher's face, which she quickly wiped away. She realized that this was not a story of sadness, but of love. A love so great that it transcended time, death, and even conventional logic. As spring gave way to the relentless summer, a new challenge arose. Small insects, attracted by the only green patches in the arid landscape, began to devour the tender leaves of the seedlings. Each morning, Anthony found more damaged plants, his efforts unraveling before his eyes. News of the pest spread quickly through the village, reinforcing the belief of many that the old man's project was not only useless, but doomed to fail from the start. The mockery increased now with a thinly disguised tone of satisfaction. "See, even nature is against this madness," commented David in the village store, where the men gathered on hot afternoons. "It's a sign for the old man to give up and accept things as they are." Helen, who was entering the establishment at that moment, felt indignation rise within her. She was about to respond when a serene voice sounded behind her. "Signs are there to be interpreted, not to determine our paths. Anthony stood in the doorway, his thin body casting a long shadow on the dirt floor. In his hands, he carried a small glass bottle containing a dark, aromatic liquid. Without saying anything more, the old man walked to the counter and asked the store owner for a few ingredients: wood ash, homemade soap, and a little used cooking oil. He paid with a few coins he took from a small leather pouch and left, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Motivated by curiosity, Helen followed Anthony to his small house on the outskirts of the village. She watched from a distance as he mixed the newly acquired ingredients with the contents of the bottle, murmuring words she couldn't distinguish. It seemed like a prayer or perhaps an old recipe passed down through generations. Gathering courage, she approached. The old man's eyes showed no surprise at seeing her. "My wife, Teresa, knew the secrets of plants like no one else," he explained, continuing to mix the ingredients with a small twig. Before the doctors from the city, she was the one who took care of the village's sick. This remedy was one of her favorites for warding off pests without killing God's creatures. Helen looked with fascination at the dark mixture that emanated a strong, yet not unpleasant aroma. "Can I help?" she offered, extending her hands. Anthony's smile lit up his face like the sunrise. "Of course you can, teacher. In fact, I'll need many hands if we want to save our little warriors." That afternoon, an unusual sight surprised the residents of Dry Valley, the young teacher and the crazy old man side by side, applying a strange mixture to each of the hundreds of seedlings planted on the hillside. They worked until the sun set, stopping only to drink water and rest briefly in the shade of a makeshift umbrella Helen had brought from home. In the days that followed, to everyone's surprise, the plants began to recover. The insects, repelled by the mixture's aroma, sought food elsewhere, allowing the damaged leaves to regenerate and new shoots to emerge. It was as if ancient wisdom, preserved in Anthony's memories, had formed an alliance with nature instead of trying to subjugate it. Summer advanced mercilessly. The sun, like a relentless tyrant, punished the land with increasing intensity. The few springs that still resisted began to dry up, and the communal well, the village's main water source, dwindled to alarming levels. The village council, made up of the oldest men, met to discuss rationing measures. It was at this meeting that David, who had never hidden his contempt for Anthony's project, made a proposal that found immediate support. Water is scarce, and we need to prioritize. The crops that feed us should have preference over personal projects that don't benefit the community. The verdict was unanimous. Water from the communal well would be allocated exclusively to small family gardens and domestic animals. Any other use would be prohibited until the end of the dry spell. When Helen brought the news to Anthony, she found him kneeling beside one of the most developed seedlings, a small acacia that already reached his knee height. The old man listened in silence, his face impassive, but his eyes betrayed the worry he felt. "What will you do now?" she asked, sitting beside him on the dry earth. Anthony delicately stroked the acacia leaves with fingers that trembled not only from age but from contained emotion. "The strongest trees have roots that go far beyond the surface, teacher. They seek water where no one else believes it exists." He fixed his gaze on the distant horizon. "Perhaps it's time to do the same." The next morning, even before the first ray of sun, Helen found Anthony at the edge of a small ravine on the lowest part of the hillside. With surprising tenacity for his age, he was digging into the hard soil, following what seemed to be an invisible path. Sweat trickled down his face, mixing with the dust that clung to his skin. "What are you looking for, Mr. Anthony?" she asked, concerned about the effort he was making. "Water," he replied simply without interrupting his work. "Many years ago, when I arrived in Dry Valley with my wife, the elders spoke of an underground river that flowed beneath these hills. Over time, the story was forgotten, treated as just another baseless legend. But Teresa always believed. She said she could feel the water, as if the earth whispered secrets to her." Helen looked around. The hillside, though still predominantly arid, now displayed green patches where the small trees struggled to survive. It was a miracle in itself that they had resisted so long with so little water. "How can I help?" she offered, rolling up her sleeves. The work was exhausting. Days turned into weeks as the two dug, following Anthony's instinct and a few clues that only his experienced eyes could detect. A subtle change in soil color, the presence of certain types of insects, the behavior of plant roots. In the village, news of the crazy old man's new undertaking provoked mixed reactions. Some scoffed openly, seeing it as further proof of senility. Others began to watch with a silent curiosity, impressed by the unwavering persistence of someone who should have been enjoying his well-deserved rest. It was Sarah, the girl with the messy braids, who first mentioned the old stories during a class. "My grandma said her grandma used to tell stories about a big river that flowed under the ground," she commented, while the class discussed the water cycle. She said the old people knew where to find water even when it didn't rain for years. Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. Could it be possible that the old legends contained more truth than the skeptics wanted to admit? That same afternoon, after dismissing the students, she went to the small village library, a cramped room attached to the school, where donated books and old documents shared space with school supplies. She immersed herself in diaries and records of the early settlers, searching for any mention of the underground river. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun was already setting when her tired eyes found a passage in a yellowed diary from nearly a century ago. The lands east of the village, though seemingly arid, hold a treasure greater than gold. Beneath the rocky hillside flows a vein of crystal-clear water, revealed only to the eyes of those who have faith enough to seek it. We identified 3 points where the water approaches the surface, marked on the attached map. Helen frantically searched for the mentioned map, but it seemed to have been lost to time. However, the description of the 3 points was detailed enough that she could try to locate them. One of them, she realized with a pounding heart, corresponded exactly to the place where Anthony had chosen to begin his reforestation project. Coincidence? Or was it possible that the old man, in some mysterious way, had been guided to that specific spot? With the diary carefully tucked into her bag, she ran to the hillside. She found Anthony resting in the shade of one of the most developed trees, his face showing clear signs of exhaustion. "You need to rest, Mr. Anthony," she warned, concerned about the paleness of his skin. "Time doesn't wait for those who have little of it, my dear," he replied with a weak smile. "Each day that passes is one less day to see my little ones thrive." Helen showed him the diary, explaining her discovery with barely contained enthusiasm. As she read the ancient words, Anthony's eyes regained their characteristic sparkle. "See, it's not a coincidence," she exclaimed. "You were drawn to this exact place as if you knew from the beginning." Anthony was silent for a long moment, contemplating the horizon where the sun was setting in a spectacle of vibrant colors. Teresa used to say there are 2 kinds of knowledge, teacher. The kind we learn with our minds, and the kind we feel with our hearts. His voice acquired a depth that revealed worlds of accumulated wisdom. Perhaps my heart knew what my mind had forgotten. The next morning, armed with the coordinates from the old diary, they resumed digging. Anthony seemed rejuvenated by the renewed hope, working with a vigor that surprised even Helen. Using long rods, they probed the ground as they advanced, looking for signs of moisture or changes in soil consistency. It was at dusk on the 3rd day of searching that the miracle happened. The rod Anthony was using penetrated deeper than usual, and when he pulled it out, the tip was damp. A reverent silence fell over them as they contemplated that first tangible evidence that they were not chasing an impossible dream. With hands trembling from emotion and fatigue, Anthony widened the hole. The earth, initially dry and resistant, gradually became darker and more malleable. And then, in an explosion of pure joy, a small jet of water emerged from the ground like a shy spring finally finding the courage to reveal itself. Helen couldn't hold back her tears. It was water. Fresh, crystal-clear water, emerging from a place where against all odds it shouldn't exist. Anthony knelt, allowing the precious liquid to wet his wrinkled hands, and then his face in a symbolic baptism that washed away months of doubt and hardship. News spread through the village faster than the wind preceding a storm. Before the sun had completely set, A small crowd was already gathering around the newly discovered spring. Skeptical faces gave way to expressions of astonishment, and in some cases, shame for having doubted so openly. David, who had always led the criticism of Anthony's project, stood at a distance, watching with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant respect. The village council met in an extraordinary session that same night. After hours of heated discussion, a unanimous decision was made. The water from the new spring would be shared between the village's needs and the reforestation project. More than that, volunteers would be organized to help Anthony expand the planted area and develop an efficient irrigation system. Autumn arrived, bringing a softness to the air that contrasted with the brutal summer left behind. Anthony's trees, now adequately irrigated, showed vigorous growth. The hillside landscape was gradually transforming. Where before there was only dry earth and stones, now a green carpet stretched, dotted with different species the old man had carefully selected for that specific ecosystem. The spring, initially modest, had revealed itself to be part of a more significant vein. With the help of specialists from the nearby city, attracted by the extraordinary news, the village began to develop a sustainable collection and distribution system that promised to definitively solve the chronic problem of scarcity. It was during these days of renewed hope that an unexpected visitor arrived in Dry Valley. Richard Smith, a representative of a large natural resources company, appeared in a gleaming pickup truck that caused a stir among the children, unaccustomed to such imposing vehicles. His proposal to the village council was tempting: the purchase of the hillside land for a price that far exceeded its apparent value, with the promise of well-paying jobs for locals in the operation that would be established. The water vein you discovered is just the tip of a significant aquifer, he explained during the meeting, displaying impressive maps and charts. With our technology, we can extract much more water than these artisanal methods allow, market it to other regions, and bring real prosperity to Dry Valley. The council members' eyes gleamed at the prospect of immediate and unprecedented wealth. The proposal seemed like an answer to the prayers of a community that, for generations, had struggled against poverty and scarcity. Only Helen, who was attending the meeting as the school's representative, noticed the shadow that crossed Anthony's face, sitting discreetly at the back of the hall. At the end of the presentation, when the enthusiastic applause subsided, the old man slowly stood up. All eyes turned to him, some impatient, others curious. "May I ask a question, Sir Businessman?" His voice, though weak, carried a dignity that commanded respect. Richard Smith nodded with a professional smile. "After you extract all this water, what will happen to the land?" An uncomfortable silence filled the room. The businessman cleared his throat before answering. "Well, natural resources aren't eternal, my friend. Eventually the aquifer will run dry, of course. But by then, we will have generated enough wealth for everyone here to live comfortably or even move to better places." Anthony slowly shook his head. "So we're talking about selling the future for a comfortable present, about destroying in one generation what nature took millennia to create." The businessman chuckled lightly, with the condescension young people often show when talking to the very old. "That's quite a simplistic view, sir. We're talking about progress, economic development, concepts that are perhaps a bit too complex for your understanding." The council members stirred, divided between respect for the elder and the magnetic pull of the proposal. In the end, they decided to postpone the decision for a few days, enough time for everyone to reflect properly. Upon leaving the meeting, Helen caught up with Anthony, who was walking slowly, leaning on his wooden staff. "What will we do?" she asked, feeling the weight of uncertainty on her shoulders. Anthony smiled serenely, like someone who had faced too many storms to be shaken by another dark cloud on the horizon. "Truth has deep roots, teacher, like our trees. Time is on our side, not theirs." That night, while the village buzzed with heated discussions about the proposal, Anthony had a vivid dream. He saw Teresa, his beloved wife, and Louise, the daughter he had lost so early, walking among enormous trees that cast welcoming shadows. The hillside, in his dream, was an exuberant oasis where crystal-clear water flowed freely, forming small streams that meandered through the lush vegetation. Children played, adults rested in the shade, and a deep peace permeated everything. Teresa turned to him with that smile that had always been his safe harbor. "You're almost there, my love. Don't give up now." He woke up with tears in his eyes, but with a renewed certainty in his heart. He wasn't just fighting for an old promise. He was fighting for the future of Dry Valley, for a legacy that transcended his own existence. The days that followed were filled with intense activity. Helen, inspired by Anthony's unwavering determination, delved into research. She contacted universities, consulted specialists in hydrogeology and ecology, gathered evidence on the long-term impacts of commercial aquifer exploitation in arid regions. The school children, infected by the teachers' enthusiasm, became little researchers interviewing the village elders, collecting stories about what Dry Valley was like before the Great Drought, drawing their vision for the future, their land. On the eve of the decisive meeting, the hillside witnessed a moving spectacle. Dozens of residents of all ages planting trees side by side with Anthony. Among them was David, who, after days of silent reflection, had arrived, with his entire family to offer help. "I spent my life looking for shortcuts to prosperity, Mr. Anthony," he admitted, with sincere humility. "Perhaps it's time to learn to plant a future I won't see, but that my grandchildren can enjoy." Night fell upon a hillside transformed not only by the hundreds of new seedlings, but by the spirit of community that blossomed as vigorously as the small trees. The council meeting the next morning was the most attended Dry Valley had ever seen. The small community hall overflowed with people, and many crowded outside, trying to hear through the open windows. Richard Smith presented his proposal again, substantially increasing the financial offer, as if monetary value could silence the doubts arising in the villagers' hearts. When it was Helen's turn to speak, she didn't stand alone. Beside her were her students, each holding a drawing or a text they had prepared. With simple but powerful words, the young teacher presented scientific evidence on how the reforestation project, in the long run, would not only preserve the aquifer, but could eventually change the region's microclimate, increasing air humidity and the probability of rain. "What we have before us is not a choice between money and trees," she concluded, her voice firm despite her emotion. "It is a choice between temporary profit that will primarily benefit strangers and lasting prosperity that will belong to all of us and the generations that will come after us." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Sarah, the girl with the messy braids, stepped forward, handing her drawing to the council president. A colorful image of Dry Valley transformed into a green valley, with houses surrounded by leafy trees and children playing in clear streams. Finally, all eyes turned to Anthony, who stood up with difficulty. His fragile body seemed carried by an inner strength that transcended matter. 72 years ago, he began, his voice initially trembling, gaining firmness with each word. "I lost my daughter to thirst. Louise was only 6 years old and had a whole life ahead of her. That night I made a promise that took me decades to begin fulfilling." The silence was so profound that one could hear the beating of an insect's wings. "I don't plant trees for myself. I have lived my life, and soon, I will be reunited with those I love and who left before me. I plant for you." His eyes swept the room, briefly meeting the gaze of every person present. "For your children, for your grandchildren's children. I plant because I believe that Dry Valley can once again be the paradise it once was, where life prospers instead of just surviving." Silent tears streamed down the faces of many present. The businessman, sensing the emotional tide turning against his proposal, made one last play. "Sentiments are beautiful, Mr. Anthony, but they don't fill empty bellies. The money we offer can transform lives today, not in some uncertain future that may never come." It was David who responded, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. "We've been selling our future for too long, Sir Businessman. Perhaps it's time to start buying it back, one tree at a time." The vote was unanimous. Dry Valley rejected the commercial exploitation proposal and embraced the reforestation project as the community's official policy. More than that, they decided to invest in infrastructure to maximize the benefits of the discovered spring. developing sustainable irrigation techniques, and gradually expanding the green area. Winter arrived earlier that year, bringing cold winds, uncommon for the region. The young trees, still vulnerable, faced their first major seasonal challenge. Many did not survive the first frosts, their tender branches blackening under the relentless cold. Anthony, whose health had visibly deteriorated, in recent weeks could no longer climb the hillside daily. From the window of his small house, he watched with anguish the brown patches appearing on the green carpet he had created with so much love. "They are dying, Helen," he murmured, when the teacher came to visit him on a particularly cold afternoon. "Everything we built?" Helen held his wrinkled hands in hers, feeling how cold and fragile they were. "Not all of them will die, Mr. Anthony. The strongest ones will survive and become even more resilient. That's how nature works, isn't it? Testing, selecting, strengthening." But winter seemed determined to test the limits of resistance not only of the trees, but also of the community's determination. When an unexpected snowstorm, the first many of the younger residents had ever witnessed, covered the hillside with a white mantle, discouragement began to spread. The project seemed doomed before it even had a real chance. It was amidst this climate of uncertainty that Sarah appeared at school with an idea inspired by a book Helen had read to the class. "What if we protected the trees with blankets like we do with people when it's cold?" The suggestion, in its childlike simplicity, was brilliant. Within days, the entire village mobilized in an unprecedented operation. Old fabrics, burlap sacks, dry straw, anything that could offer some protection against the cold was gathered. Entire families climbed the hillside, carefully wrapping, each surviving seedling in its own improvised winter coat. The sight of that collective effort, that tangible demonstration of faith in the future, was the best medicine for Anthony. Although his body was increasingly weak, confining him to bed most of the time, his spirit gained renewed strength with every report Helen and the children brought about the progress on the hillside. It was during one of these visits that he entrusted Helen with an old leather-bound notebook. "Here is all the knowledge I have gathered throughout this journey. Which plants thrive best in our land, when to plant them, how to protect them from pests, where to look for water." His eyes, though sunken from illness, shone with their usual intensity. "Continue the work, teacher. Not for me, but for all of us." Spring arrived with surprising generosity. Moderate but constant rains, a phenomenon Dry Valley hadn't experienced for decades, transformed the landscape. The earth, previously cracked and hostile, softened under the blessing of the water falling from the heavens, as if nature itself wanted to reward the unwavering faith of its most persistent children. On the hillside, the miracle unfolded before the astonished eyes of the villagers. The trees that had survived the harsh winter showed explosive growth. New leaves, a vibrant green, sprouted from branches that weeks before seemed doomed. And more surprising than anything, seeds that had remained dormant in the soil began to germinate spontaneously, as if a silent message had traveled through the earth, announcing that it was safe to be born. Specialists were called to study the phenomenon. They confirmed what Anthony had always known intuitively. The reforestation was beginning to change the local microclimate. The trees, even young, were already retaining moisture, reducing soil temperature, creating conditions for other forms of life to flourish. It was the beginning of a virtuous cycle that, if maintained, could eventually reverse decades of degradation. News spread, extending beyond the borders of Dry Valley. Journalists, environmentalists, government representatives, everyone wanted to witness what was being called the miracle of the hillside. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but all left deeply impacted by the living demonstration of how human determination could work in harmony with nature to restore what seemed irrecoverably lost. In his bed, surrounded by Helen, the school children, and many of the villagers who had once scoffed at his project, Anthony received the news with a serene smile. His body was rapidly wasting away now, life escaping like sand between his fingers. But in his eyes there was a profound peace, the tranquility of someone who had fulfilled his mission. "I want to see my trees one last time," he whispered on a particularly bright April morning. The request, seemingly impossible given his weakened state, mobilized the entire village. A stretcher was improvised, and 8 strong men, including David, now one of the project's most fervent advocates, took turns carrying him to the hillside. The spectacle awaiting Anthony surpassed even the most enthusiastic accounts. The hillside, which just a year before was a symbol of desolation, had transformed into an emerging oasis. Hundreds of trees, some already several feet tall, swayed gently in the spring breeze. Among them, wildflowers bloomed in colorful patches, and the buzzing of bees and the singing of birds, sounds long absent from Dry Valley, filled the air with a symphony of renewed life. The men placed his stretcher under the shade of a two-year young acacia, the first one he and Helen had saved from the pest the previous summer. There, with his head gently resting on the teacher's lap, Anthony contemplated his work with eyes that were already beginning to cloud over. "See, Louise," he murmured, speaking to someone only he could see. Daddy kept his promise. A single tear rolled down his wrinkled face while a smile of infinite peace lit up his face. "I knew I'd see the shadows," were his last words, spoken with a quiet certainty, like someone who had always known that the impossible was just a matter of time and faith. 3 days later, the entire village of Dry Valley attended Anthony's funeral, held on the hillside itself, under the trees that were his living legacy. By unanimous decision of the community, the place was officially renamed Forest of the Promise, and an educational program was established so that each new generation of children would learn the story of the old man who planted trees knowing he wouldn't live to see their shadows. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. The trees grew, multiplied, extended their roots deep into the increasingly fertile soil. Water, once scarce, became abundant, nourishing not only the vegetation, but also the hopes and dreams of a community that rediscovered its connection to the land. And every spring, when new seedlings are planted to expand the forest, Helen, now a mature woman with silver threads in her hair, tells the children Anthony's story, not as a distant legend, but as a living reminder that true love is manifested in actions that transcend time, in seeds planted with faith in the future, in promises made and kept despite all obstacles. For as she always tells the attentive little eyes surrounding her, Anthony's greatest lesson was not the trees he planted, but the deep understanding that we live not only for ourselves, but also for those who will come after us. And that, sometimes the greatest act of faith is to plant a seed, knowing you may never see the tree, but believing that others will rest under its shade and feel gratitude for someone who had the courage to dream beyond the horizon of their own life. And so, in Dry Valley, which would now need to find a new name to reflect its transformed reality, an old man's promise to his daughter lives on, not just in the trees that grow stronger each year, but in the hearts of the people who learned, through his example, that the true legacy of a life is not measured by the years lived, but by the love sown that continues to flourish long after our last farewell.